The Knights Templar have been associated with all sorts of incredible activities, including having the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, a secret fleet that sailed the oceans, and an awe-inspiring self-confidence and courage that made their enemies shudder in fear. Despite their fearsome, battle-hardened reputation, the Knights Templar were learned men, dedicated to protecting travelers and pilgrims of all religions, not just Christians. They were great statesmen, politically adept, economic traders, and they were apparently allied with the great sailor fraternity that had created a worldwide trading empire in Phoenician times. Despite a great deal of negative propaganda against the Templars at the time of their suppression, they are still known today as the preservers of knowledge and sacred objects. While the origins of the Knights Templar are said to go back to the building of King Solomon's Temple by Phoenician masons from Tyre, or even the Great Pyramid in Atlantis, we trace their modern history from the Crusades period of the Middle Ages. The Knights Templar began when a group of 9 French knights came to Jerusalem in the year 1118 AD. These knights petitioned the king of Jerusalem to allow them to live in the ancient Temple of Solomon, then partly a mosque and partly in ruins. In his book The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral, the French architect Louis Charpentier claims that the Knights Templar built Chartres as a repository for ancient wisdom. This repository is equal to Stonehenge, the Temple of Solomon, or the Great Pyramid of Egypt. He further claims that special knowledge about the temple in Jerusalem was gained by the founding group of 9 knights who lived at Solomon's Temple starting in 1118 AD. In that year, it is historically recorded that 9 French knights presented themselves to a Christian king, Baldwin II of Jerusalem, and explained that they planned to form themselves into a company with a plan for protecting pilgrims from robbers and murderers along the public highways leading to the Holy City. King Baldwin II had been a prisoner of the Saracens and knew of their infighting. Factions such as the Assassins were active in Muslim politics. They also asked to be housed within a wing of the palace, a wing that happened to be adjacent to the Dome of the Rock Mosque, which was built on the site of Solomon's Temple. The king granted their request, and the Order of the Knights of Solomon's Temple, or Knights Templar, was born. 10 years later, the 9 knights presented themselves to the Pope, who gave his official approval to the Knights Templar. Although only 9 mysterious knights existed, a 10th joined them, who was the Count of Champagne, an important French noble. In fact, none of the poor knights was apparently poor, nor were they all French. Several came from important French and Flemish families. Of the 10 original knights, 4 have not been identified, although their names are known. Furthermore, it seems unlikely that the Knights of the Temple of Solomon were formed to protect the pilgrims to Jerusalem, because such an order of knights already existed. They were the Knights Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John, later to become the Knights of Malta. It is important not to confuse the Knights Templar with the Knights of Malta, as many readers, and some historians, do. The Knights Templar are quite different from the other Crusaders and were sometimes said to fight in combat against each other, even in the Holy Land. The Knights Hospitallers, which still exist today as the Knights of Malta, were forced to leave Malta by Napoleon, who stopped at the island on his way to Egypt. Today, the Knights of Malta reside in Italy, still have their own sovereign country, and are said to be a secret society for the Vatican. Charles Addison, a London lawyer, who wrote in his 1842 book The History of the Knights Templar, mentions in the first few pages how it was commonly believed the Templars were at odds with the Vatican and their military arm, the Knights Hospitallers. Addison denies the rumors, but admits such rumors existed. Charpentier likens the original band of Knights Templar to commandos who raided the ancient Temple of Solomon in order to uncover its engineering secrets and possible lost treasure, such as the Ark of the Covenant, possibly hidden deep in a strange cavern system beneath the temple. With the help of the brilliant French abbot Bernard de Clairvaux, The 9 knights, directed by the Count of Champagne, created the Knights Templar. With the money that they accumulated, a cathedral at Chartres was built. Later, other cathedrals were built around Europe, and the legends of the master stonemasons became common. Incorporated into Chartres Cathedral are beautiful stained glass windows, many of the colors difficult or impossible to duplicate today. Hidden within the cathedral are various ancient cubits of measure, plus such esoteric devices as the famous Chartres maze and other visual tools such as sacred geometry, for personal transformation, a sort of personal alchemy of the soul. Included in the image was the quest for the Holy Grail. When a nobleman would join their ranks, he would surrender his castle and property to the knights, who would use revenues generated from the property to purchase weapons, war horses, armor, and other military supplies. The ranks of the Knights Templar grew rapidly. Other noblemen and kings who were not members often gave them gifts of money and land. King Stephen of England contributed his valuable English manor of Cressing in Essex. He also made arrangements for high-ranking members of the Knights to visit nobles of England and Scotland. Pope Eugenius decreed that the Knights Templar and only the Knights Templar would wear a special red cross with blunt wedge-shaped arms called the cross patee on the left breasts of their white robes, so that they could be quickly recognized at any time by Christians and by other Templars on the field of battle. The white robes with red crosses became their required dress. The warrior knights fought bravely in the Middle East, and were highly respected by their Muslim counterparts for their strategy and bravery. In 1129, the Templar Grand Master, Hugh de Payens, led a company of 300 knights, recruited from the noblest houses of Europe, to accompany a huge train of pilgrims to Jerusalem. During this time, the Templars formed part of a contingent which, allied with the assassins of Persia, tried to take the important city of Damascus. According to Archon Daral in his book A History of Secret Societies, the followers of Hassan ibn Sabah, leader of the assassins, were definitely in contact with the Templars, and apparently the assassins were prepared to become Christians should their goals be met, which they were not. At one point, a payment of 3,000 gold pieces from the Syrian branch of the assassins was made to the Templar order, apparently as some form of tribute. The exact association between the Templars and the assassins has remained a mystery. The Templars, it must be said on this regard, were not noted for political assassinations, as were the assassins. Rather, the Templars fell victim to political intrigue and were either publicly executed or assassinated, as was Henry Sinclair, Grand Master of the Templars, in 1401, when the Templar fleet returned from North America. Many Templars were of Palestinian birth, spoke perfect Arabic, and were familiar with every religious sect, cult, and magical doctrine, including the assassins. For instance, the Grand Master Philip of Nablus, 1167 AD, was a Syrian. The assassins, it might be mentioned, eventually became what is known today as the Ismaili sect of Islam. Their head is the Aga Khan, and their followers reside largely in Pakistan and India, today. The Aga Khan, a hereditary leadership descended from Muhammad, maintains residences in both London and Bombay. The father of today's Aga Khan was married to Hollywood actress Rita Hayworth. By 1133, King Alfonso of Aragon and Navarre, northern Spain, had fought the invading Moors in 29 battles, and willed his kingdom to the Templars. However, the Templars were prevented from claiming the kingdom because of the Moorish victory over Spain. Meanwhile, there was a parallel religious order, the Knights of St. John, founded at Amalfi, Italy, in the 11th century. They went to Jerusalem to protect and minister to the Christian pilgrims, but soon extended their mission to tending to the sick and poor all over the Holy Land. As the years went by, the Knights of St. John, Knights Hospitallers, became increasingly militant and, generally speaking, fought alongside the more mystical Knights Templar and the Germanic order of the Teutonic Knights of St. Mary. With the fall of Jerusalem in 1309, the Knights of St. John retreated first to Cyprus and then to Rhodes. As the main base for the Crusaders in their struggle against the Ottoman Empire, Rhodes was a fortress, a prison, and a supply base for the ships and armies on their way to Palestine and Asia Minor. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet Fatih failed to clarify the succession question of the newly powerful Ottoman Empire, in 1481, a battle between his two sons at Bursa resulted and Jem was defeated by his brother Bayazid. Jem fled to Egypt but was denied asylum by the Mamelukes who controlled that country for the Ottomans. Jem took the irreversible step of fleeing to Rhodes, where he appealed to the archenemies of the Ottomans, the Knights Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John. With his brother now in the hands of the Crusader army, Bayazid knew he was in trouble and the Ottoman Empire had to respond quickly. Bayazid shrewdly contacted the Knights of St. John and negotiated a contract to pay 45,000 ducats of gold annually, a huge sum at the time, in return for the imprisonment of his brother on Rhodes and later in the English tower at the castle in Bodrum, on the Turkish mainland. The Knights eventually handed their valuable prisoner over to the Vatican, where Jem was made an interesting offer to lead a Crusader army to recapture Istanbul, Constantinople. To stop this final threat from his wayward brother Bayazid spared no expense, paying to the Vatican 120,000 gold ducats and a number of sacred relics from Jerusalem, including the famous Spear of Destiny. This was also known as the Lance of Longinus and was reportedly the spearhead of the Roman centurion Longinus that was used to pierce the side of Jesus while on the cross. Another artifact offered was the Sponge of the Last Refreshment. This was the vinegar-like sponge used to wet Jesus' lips while on the cross, according to the legend of the lance. Whosoever possesses this holy lance and understands the powers it serves, holds in his hand the destiny of the world for good or evil. Adolf Hitler believed in this power and removed the lance from the Vienna Museum when the Nazis took over Austria. With this hefty payment, the Pope abandoned Jem and the plans for him to lead an army against Istanbul. Jem died alone at the Terracina prison in 1495. Rumor had it that he was eventually poisoned. Today Jem is but a footnote in history, a victim of the diplomatic maneuvers that brought the Spear of Destiny to the west. The Knights stayed on Rhodes for 213 years, transforming the city into a mighty fortress with 12-meter-thick walls. They withstood two Muslim offenses in 1444 and 1480, but in 1522 the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent staged a massive attack with 200,000 troops. A mere 600 knights with 1,000 mercenaries and 6,000 Rhodians eventually surrendered after a long siege. In 1529, Charles V, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, offered Malta to the Knights of St. John as their permanent base, and they began to build fortifications around the Grand Harbor. In 1565, the Ottoman fleet arrived at Malta and immediately attacked the fortifications. With 181 ships carrying a complement of over 30,000 men, the fleet bombarded the fortress with over 7,000 rounds of ammunition every day for over a month, and finally took St. Elmo. But the Turkish Marines had suffered many casualties and could not take the other heavily defended forts that were around the bay and inside the island. News of reinforcements coming from Sicily caused the Turks to retreat from the island, and the Great Siege was over. The Knights of St. John changed their name to the Knights of Malta and were said to be fanatically loyal to the Vatican, and the Pope apparently used them as his personal crusaders and soldiers. Other orders such as the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights were far more independent, and if anything, were trying their best to subvert the church that was centered on Rome. In fact, it was sometimes said that the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. John later to be known as the Knights of Malta, sometimes fought in combat against each other. The Knights Templar were sworn to fight the Vatican, while the Knights of Malta became the Pope's private army. The Knights then turned to the Russian Tsar Paul I, who offered to found an Orthodox League of the Knights of St. James. This deal with the Russian Tsar particularly enraged Napoleon. Napoleon sailed to Malta and made anchor just outside the Grand Harbor in June of 1798. When he was refused entry by the Knights of St. John, he began to bombard the fortress. After 2 days of shelling, the French landed and gave the Knights 4 days to leave, thus ending their 268-year presence on the island. The Pope restored the office of the Grand Master in 1879, and the Knights of St. John still exist today. They are known as the Knights of Malta, though they no longer reside in Malta at all, but have offices in various cities in Europe. Even though they have no actual territory, they are still recognized as a separate state by 40 or more countries around the world, similar to the recognition of the Vatican. Critics of the Knights of St. John, Malta claim that they are a right-wing Catholic organization that worked in Eastern Europe to suppress non-Catholic ethnic groups. Wehrmacht General Reinhard Gehlen received the highest honor given by the Knights of Malta shortly after World War II for services rendered. Gehlen has been credited with helping many former Nazi and SS officers into new positions with the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and later the Central Intelligence Agency. The Sea Empire of the Knights Templar. During the 180 years of Crusades, the Templar wealth grew into a huge fortune. They owned over 9,000 manors and castles across Europe, all of which were tax-free. Each property was farmed and produced revenues that were used to support the largest banking system in Europe. The Templar wealth and power caused suspicion and jealousy among some members of the European nobility. Slanderous rumors were spread of secret rituals and devil worship. King Philip IV of France was responsible for many of these rumors. Philip IV had taken refuge from an angry mob in Paris at the Templar headquarters there. The Templars had moved their main headquarters from Jerusalem to Paris after the Crusaders' defeat in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman navy had taken over most of the Mediterranean and were busy besieging the Knights Hospitallers on Malta. The Templars gave Philip IV refuge from the mob, but it is said that the king saw the magnificence of the Templar treasure and wanted it for himself. His nation was bankrupt, he was a weak king who was unpopular with the people, and he knew that the Templars were more powerful and wealthy than he was. King Philip IV went to Rome in 1305 and convinced Pope Clement V that the Knights Templar were not the holy defenders of the faith but were seeking to destroy it. The Pope ordered King Philip to arrest all the knights in France and begin an inquisition. When the king's men went to the Templar castles, they found many of them abandoned, and the large naval force that had been anchored at the Templar base in La Rochelle was gone. Those that were arrested were tried and found guilty of sins against God. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. A contemporary English poem asked the question that many ask today: where did all the Templars and their great wealth go? The brethren, the masters of the temple, who were well stocked and ample, with gold and silver and riches, where are they? How have they done? They had such power once that none dared take from them. None was so bold. Forever they bought and never sold. This question has plagued historians and treasure hunters for centuries. For hundreds of years there have been rumors that the Knights Templar were not only the defenders of the faith, but were also the guardians of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is said to be the most holy of religious artifacts. Different versions of the legend exist, with the two most prominent stating that the Holy Grail is the cup or chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper or a piece of the cross that he was crucified on. The chalice version of the Holy Grail has Saint Joseph of Arimathea bringing to England the cup used at the Last Supper, which had been used to collect the blood that flowed from Christ's wounds. A Welsh version of the Grail story says Saint Joseph of Arimathea brought the Grail to England with the word of Christ, and left the holy relic at Glastonbury. There it reached King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The Grail is said to have taken many forms, and King Arthur saw it in its fifth and final form while receiving communion with hermits, a bleeding lance, which was also known as the Lance of Longinus, which was discovered by the Crusaders at Antioch. This last version would put the Templars and the lance in the Middle East at the same time. Before leaving the legend of the Holy Grail, stop and think of the religious significance such a relic would have. The mysterious Knights Templar had an extensive sea network and may have inherited some of the maps and other secrets of the Phoenicians. When the Templars were outlawed and arrested in 1307 by King Philip IV of France, the huge Templar fleet at La Rochelle, France, vanished, and many Knights Templar sought refuge in lands outside of France. Portugal was one of the few places where they could find some asylum, and it is likely that the Templar fleet made a stop at Almoral Castle before continuing to its final destination. It should be noted that many Portuguese explorers and royalty were Knights Templar and later Masons. Many believe that the Portuguese Knights Templar were instrumental in Portugal acquiring its transatlantic colony, Brazil. While Portugal was an important haven for the Knights Templar, their main base of operations, until they were outlawed, was southern France and Catalunya, the area of the Cathars and the Merovingian kings. Barcelona, the capital of Catalunya, was originally a Phoenician port, and this area along the border of Spain and France has long thought of itself as Catalunya, a state, people and culture separate from the rest of Spain. The populace speaks their own language, Catalonian, a language that may have originated with ancient Phoenician. Outside of Barcelona is Montserrat Monastery, site of religious pilgrimage for a long time, probably going back even before the Christian era. It is a mountain rising 4,054 feet above the coastal plain, which eventually became the site of a celebrated Benedictine monastery. It was at Montserrat that Saint Ignatius of Loyola vowed to dedicate himself to a religious life. The monastery can be found about halfway up the steep, barren mountain. Only ruins can be found of the 11th century Benedictine monastery, and the new monastery on the site was built in the 19th century. According to the Columbia Viking Desk Encyclopedia, 1968 version, Montserrat was thought in the Middle Ages to have been the site of the castle which contained the Holy Grail. Says the encyclopedia, the Renaissance church contains a black wooden image of the Virgin, carved, according to tradition, by St. Luke. In the Middle Ages, the mountain, also called Montsalvat, was thought to have been the site of the castle of the Holy Grail. Curiously, Barcelona is the city where Columbus landed upon his return to Europe from the New World. Why did Columbus come all the way to Barcelona when he had left from Cadiz, a port that he had to pass on his way to Barcelona? Perhaps Barcelona was a safer port to land at than Cadiz? It is quite possible that Columbus was a Knight Templar. He always signed his name with a curious triangle and coded letters, something which Knights Templar were known to do. All Jews had been banished from Spain on the very day that Columbus had sailed for the New World. Some historians have claimed that Columbus was actually a Spanish Jew and not an Italian from Genoa, as later historians were to claim. If Columbus was a Jew, perhaps Barcelona and the Catalunya area was a safe haven for him and his crew. Also, Barcelona would have been a highly likely city for the secret Grand Master of the Knights Templar to reside in. One of the most interesting and mysterious of Scottish characters was Prince Henry Sinclair, the last king of the Orkney Islands. Henry Sinclair, like many other nobles of the Middle Ages, held many titles, and he was many things. He was king of the Orkney Islands, although they were officially an earldom granted to Prince Henry by the King of Norway. At the same time, Prince Henry held other territories as a vassal of the Scottish king. Prince Henry Sinclair was also a Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a veteran of the Crusades and, according to some sources, the possessor of the Holy Grail. In the year 1391 AD, Prince Henry Sinclair met with the famous explorers and mapmakers Nicholas and Antonio Zeno at Fair Island, which is located between the Orkneys and the Shetlands. The Zeno brothers were well known for their maps of Iceland and the Arctic. Prince Henry would contract them to send an exploratory fleet to the New World. With the aid of funding from the Knights Templar, who had now been banished by the Pope, Prince Henry gathered a fleet of 12 ships for a voyage to establish a safe haven for the Order of Knights and their treasure. The party was led by Prince Henry under the guidance of Antonio Zeno, the mapmaker from Venice. The fleet left the Orkneys in 1398 and landed in Nova Scotia, wintered there and later explored the eastern seaboard of the United States. It is said that the effigy of one of Henry's close companions, Sir James Gunn, who died on the expedition, is to be found carved upon a rock face at Westford, Massachusetts. The party is said to have built a castle and left a portion of their navy in Nova Scotia. As we shall see, the famous Oak Island just off the mainland of Nova Scotia is to become part of the mystery surrounding Prince Henry Sinclair. Prince Henry and his fleet returned to the Orkneys, but shortly afterward Prince Henry was assassinated in Scotland. The year was 1400 and it was another 92 years before Cristobal Colon, known to us as Columbus, was to use his knowledge of Iceland and the Zeno brothers' maps to make his famous voyage across the Atlantic. In his book Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, Michael Bradley attempts to show that the ancient treasure from the Temple of Solomon was kept at Montségur in the French Pyrenees, the Cathar region of France. This mountain fortress was besieged by the forces of Simon de Montfort and the Inquisition on March 16, 1244, but it is believed that the secret treasure escaped. The treasure probably included both ancient treasure from the Middle East but also gold, silver and jewelry of more modern manufacture. The Knights Templar were well funded in secret by various royalty. After all, the Merovingian kings were of the holy blood of Jesus, or so it was claimed. Bradley asserts that Prince Henry took over as many as 300 colonists to the New World and a literal Grail Castle was built in Nova Scotia, the New Scotland. So strong is the evidence for Prince Henry Sinclair's voyage across the Atlantic with the Knights Templar that his distant relative Andrew Sinclair wrote a book entitled The Sword and the Grail, in which he claimed much the same as Bradley in Holy Grail Across the Atlantic. The Templars may have also come into the possession of some highly accurate maps made by the Moors and Turks, and in so doing, inherited the secret sea knowledge once guarded so carefully by the Carthaginians and their allies. Bradley and Sinclair claim that a special Grail castle was built in an area of central Nova Scotia called the Cross. This spot could be reached via river from either side of the Nova Scotia peninsula, and at the mouths of both rivers was an island called Oak Island. Curiously, one of these Oak Islands has the famous Money Pit, which is a man-made shaft hundreds of feet deep with side tunnels. It is believed that there is a treasure in this pit, and millions of dollars have been spent in attempts to reach the submerged bottom of the pit. It has been traditionally believed that the Oak Island Money Pit was built by pirates to hide a treasure, but Bradley and Sinclair claim that it was built by Sinclair and the Knights Templar. Furthermore, they claim Canada was settled as a direct result of the Holy Grail being taken there. Sinclair and the Templars were attempting to create the prophesied New Jerusalem in the New World. The final stand of the Knights Templar, the Lost Templar Fleet, is discussed in Michael Bagent and Richard Lee's book The Temple and the Lodge. They point out that the Templars had a huge fleet at their disposal, a fleet that was stationed out of ports in Mediterranean France and Italy as well as ports in northern France, Flanders and Portugal. On the whole, the Templar fleet was geared towards operation in the Mediterranean, keeping the Holy Land supplied with men and equipment, and importing commodities from the Middle East into Europe. At the same time, the fleet did operate in the Atlantic. Extensive trade was conducted with the British Isles and, very probably, with the Baltic Hanseatic League. Thus communities subordinate to the Templars, called preceptories in Europe, in England and Ireland, were generally located on the coast or on navigable rivers. The primary Atlantic port for the Templars was La Rochelle, which had good communication with Mediterranean ports. Cloth, for example, could be brought from Britain on Templar ships to La Rochelle, transported overland to a Mediterranean port such as Collioure, then loaded aboard Templar ships again and carried to the Holy Land. By this means, it was possible to avoid the always risky passage through the Straits of Gibraltar, usually controlled by the Saracens. When the order was persecuted by Philip IV of France starting in 1307 and culminating in the burning at the stake of Jacques de Molay in 1314, the Knights Templar became an outlawed organization. Philip IV of France persecuted them because of their financial and political power, but to many historians the persecution was part of a continued campaign against early Christian heretics like the Cathars. Indeed, there is a great deal of evidence to show that the Knights Templar and the Cathars were strongly allied. The Knights Templar were apparently part of a secret movement to restore the Merovingian kings, who had the holy blood of Jesus in their veins. The question is, what happened to the Templar fleet after they were outlawed? Traditional history has no answer to this question. Bagent and Lee in the Temple and the Lodge claim that the Templar fleet escaped en masse from the various ports in the Mediterranean and northern Europe and left for a mysterious destination where they could find political asylum and safety. This destination was Scotland. The Mediterranean fleet had to sail through the dangerous Straits of Gibraltar and then probably stopped at various Portuguese ports that were sympathetic to the Templars such as Almoral Castle, near the town of Abrantes. The fortress of Almoral was constructed by Gualdum Pays, master of the Order of the Templars in 1171. Bagent and Lee go on to say that the Templar fleet sailed up the west coast of Ireland to the safe ports in Donegal and Ulster, where Templar properties were located and arms smuggling to Argyll was common. The Templar fleet then landed in Argyll by sailing to the south of the islands of Islay and Jura into the Sound of Jura, where the Templars unloaded men and cargo at the Scottish Templar strongholds of Kilmory, Castle Sweet and Kilmartin. Robert the Bruce controlled portions of Scotland, but not all of it. Significant portions of the northern and southern Highlands were controlled by clans that were allied with England. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope in 1306, 1 year before the persecution of the Templars began. Essentially, the papal decree that outlawed the Knights Templar was not applicable in Scotland, or at least the parts that Robert the Bruce controlled. The turning of the tide for Robert the Bruce, Scotland and the Knights Templar was the famous Battle of Bannockburn, which took place on June 24, 1324. While visiting Scotland, I drove out of Edinburgh looking for the site of the Battle of Bannockburn. It is known to have taken place within 2.5 miles of Stirling Castle. On June 24 of 1324, Robert the Bruce of Scotland with approximately 6,000 Scots miraculously defeated 20,000 English soldiers. Exactly what took place has never really been recorded. It is believed by some that Bruce did it with the help of a special force of Knights Templar. After all, June 24 was also a special day to the Knights Templar. It was St. John's Day. Say Bagent and Lee. Most historians concur that the Scottish army was made up almost entirely of foot soldiers armed with pikes, spears and axes. They also concur that only mounted men in the Scottish ranks carried swords, and that Bruce had few such men. Quote. Suddenly in the midst of the battle, with the English forces engaged in a 3-to-1 combat against the Scottish soldiers, there was a charge from the rear of the Scottish camp. A fresh force with banners flying rode forth to do battle with the English. The English ranks took one look at the new force, and in sheer terror of the new combatants, they literally fled the field, save Bagent and Lee in the temple and the lodge, after a day of combat which had left both English and Scottish armies exhausted. Panic swept the English ranks. King Edward, together with 500 of his knights, abruptly fled the field. Demoralized, the English foot soldiers promptly followed suit, and the withdrawal deteriorated quickly into a full-scale rout, the entire English army abandoning their supplies, their baggage, their money, their gold and silver plate, their arms, armor and equipment. But while the chronicles speak of dreadful slaughter, the recorded English losses do not in fact appear to have been very great. Only one earl is reported killed, only 38 barons and knights. The English collapse appears to have been caused not by the ferocity of the Scottish assault, which they were managing to withstand, but simply by fear. In fact, what probably happened was a charge by the remaining forces of Knights Templar against the English army. These Crusade veterans were like the Green Berets or Special Forces of the Middle Ages. All combatants suddenly stopped to witness the charging army of Knights Templar, in full regalia with white banners and Red Cross insignias flying high above the mounted Grail Knights. The probable strategy behind the Templars' charge into battle would have been to ride through the thick of the battle and attempt to reach King Edward and his personal guards. Once engaged with the commanding officers of the English foe, these seasoned war veterans would have easily defeated King Edward's knights and possibly killed the king himself. As noted, King Edward and his special knights immediately fled upon witnessing the Templar charge. The 1995 Oscar-winning movie, Braveheart, concluded by depicting Robert the Bruce and his charge at Bannockburn. My friend Lionel Fanthorpe back in Wales had told me that I should visit Roslin Chapel while I was near Edinburgh, so I headed south from the Bannockburn battle area. It was just about noon when I arrived at Roslin Chapel in the Lothian Hills south of Edinburgh. I parked the car and walked around the small but ornate chapel. It was a Sunday and there was a church service going on inside, so I looked at some of the graves in the cemetery on the west side of the building. When the service finished, a tall, thin man in a tweed sport coat came out of the chapel and stood in the courtyard for a moment. "Excuse me," I said to him, "but isn't Roslin Chapel associated with the Knights Templar?" "Oh, yes indeed," the man said. "This chapel was built by William St. Clair, Grand Master of the Templars." We stood there for a moment talking about the chapel and the Knights Templar, when he told me he had written several books on Roslin, the Knights Templar, the Holy Grail and the Spear of Destiny. "I co-wrote Mark of the Beast with Trevor Ravenscroft," he said, "plus these other books for sale at the chapel gift shop." "I've read the Mark of the Beast," I said. "Are you Tim Wallace Murphy?" "Indeed I am," he acknowledged, a bit surprised that I knew who he was and had read one of his books. "It's a pleasure to meet you," I said, and we talked a bit about the Battle of Bannockburn, since I had just come from the area of the battlefield. "The charge of the Knights Templar at Bannockburn must have been quite a sight," I said. "Were any of the knights killed?" "No, not a one," he said. "The English fled in total fear of the seasoned warriors. Not even one Knights Templar was killed." "Well, that's the kind of statistic I like," I said. Privately, I wondered if this battle was the reciprocal battle to the last stand of the Cathars at Montségur. At Montségur, everyone had been killed. At Bannockburn, the Grail Knights had triumphed and not a man was lost. Dr. Tim Wallace Murphy took me into the gift shop where he showed me his other books on Roslin Chapel and its history. He also told me the story of Roslin, which is connected to the Orkneys and the taking of the Holy Grail to North America. The builder of Roslin Chapel, William St. Clair, was the last Sinclair, Jarl, of Orkney, who lived in the middle of the 15th century. Master Earl William, the Jarldom of Orkney, passed from the family to the Scottish crown as part of the dowry of Margaret of Denmark on to her marriage to King James III of Scotland. William was not only the grandson of Prince Henry and the last Jarl of the Orkneys, he also had the somewhat peculiar title of Knight of the Cockle and the Golden Fleece. As Dr. Wallace Murphy points out in his book, The Templar Legacy and the Masonic Inheritance within Roslin Chapel, Sir William St. Clair was a member of a secret group that preserved important knowledge concerning the Holy Grail, the holy blood of the Merovingian kings, and the destiny of the new continent across the Atlantic. Wallace Murphy speculates that the Knights of the Cockle and the Golden Fleece was the current Grail order of which Sinclair was possibly Grand Master. Clearly, the Knights Templar saw themselves as the inheritors of ancient knowledge that went back to Atlantis. They struggled for hundreds of years against the Vatican and the reign of terror known as the Inquisition. To the Templars, the true church, one that taught mysticism, reincarnation and good works, was being suppressed by a dark power that called itself the one true faith. Oppression of these other faiths was done with the familiar devices of torture, terror and extermination. Did the Templars seek to rediscover and recreate Atlantis in America? Henry Sinclair of Orkney had risked all to make his voyages across the North Atlantic. Had he taken the Holy Grail and possibly even the Ark of the Covenant to America? Had these sacred relics helped spur on the creation of the United States, a land which Masonic founding fathers like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were to create partially on the Templar ideals of religious freedom? According to Templar historians like Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, Andrew Sinclair and Tim Wallace Murphy, the Knights Templar had helped create an independent Scotland, then a New Scotland, and finally an independent United States. The present-day Knights? What of the Knights Templar today? While Masonry apparently sprang from the Templars, are there other surviving groups? The Knights Templar of Aquarius existed in the 1940s and 50s in England, based in Canfield Gardens, London, and the island of Jersey. The head of the order was an Englishman named H.C. Randall Stevens. Randall Stevens wrote several curious books, including one entitled The Chronicles of Osiris, and another entitled Atlantis to the Latter Days, which was published in 1954. In this rare book, Randall Stevens discusses various topics including Atlantis, the Great Pyramid, King Solomon's Temple and the Knights Templar. Recent conspiracy literature has painted a dark portrait of modern-day Masons, often putting the blame of an Orwellian nightmare New World Order squarely on the shoulders of a Masonic conspiracy. Murderous renegade Masonic groups like the infamous P2 organization in Italy have made world headlines. The fact that many influential businessmen are also Masons is also seen as part of the exclusive club of the puppet masters. My own opinion is that, while the Masons were a powerful political group 200 years ago, their significance in modern power struggles is probably overrated. Furthermore, their doctrines are highly misunderstood, especially by fundamentalist Christians. Knights Templar of their day, and the Revolutionary War Masons of their day, were free thinkers who rebelled against any artificial thought controls or economic controls forced upon them by the controllers. The Knights Templar lost their final battle and escaped en masse to Scotland and possibly the New World. The Revolutionary War Masons of British, Scottish descent and the Rosicrucians of German and Dutch descent succeeded in defeating the British Crown and fending off encroachment from the Vatican, in the form of Royal Spain, at the same time. Power struggles between religious, racial and political factions have occurred since the beginning of history. History records that the Knights Templar, and later the Masons, stood for philosophical and political freedom. It is difficult to believe that the Founding Fathers of America, virtually all members of secret societies linked to the Knights Templar, were trying to set up a nation that was meant to be led into a new world order police state. Rather, they were attempting to set up a nation with special safeguards against such a possibility. The checks and balances, guarantees of freedoms and inalienable rights are part of the plan for a true nation under God, a utopian society where all citizens live in peace and freedom. Yet, let us not be fooled. There is Christ and there is the Antichrist. There is the Buddha and there is the anti-Buddha, and there is the Novus Ordo Seclorum, and there is the Ante-Novus Ordo Seclorum. All prophecies remind us that a golden age once existed in the past, and a new golden age is soon to come in the future. What shall we call this new era of light? According to arcane lore, from many prophets as well as the Templars, earth changes will destroy many lands, including Europe, while new lands will rise in the Atlantic and Pacific. New countries, created by new pioneers, will settle these new lands. These same people will be escaping the devastation happening in their own countries. Perhaps the new golden age is still to come, occurring on a land that is not yet present. 1. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, 1982. Jonathan Cape, London. Published in the UK as The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. 2. The Messianic Legacy, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, 1985. Jonathan Cape, London. 3. The Temple and the Lodge, Michael Bagent and Richard Lee, 1989. Jonathan Cape, London. 4. Emerald Cup, Ark of Gold, Colonel Howard Buchner, 1991. Thunderbird Press, Metairie, Louisiana. 5. The Secrets of Rennes-le-Château, Lionel and Patricia Fanthorpe, 1991. Bellevue Books, London. 6. The History of the Knights Templars, Charles G. Addison, 1842, London. 7. A History of Secret Societies, Archon Darral, 1962, Citadel Press, NY. 8. The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral, Louis Charpentier, 1975, Avon Books, New York, 1966, Robert Laffont, Paris. 9. Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, Michael Bradley, 1988, Hounslow Press, Willowdale, Ontario. 10. The Morning of the Magicians, Jacques Bergier and Louis Pauwels, 1960, Stein and Day Publishers, New York. 11. Prince Henry Sinclair, Frederick Pohl, 1974, Clarkson Potter Publishers, New York. 12. The Sword and the Grail, Andrew Sinclair, 1992, Crown, New York. 13. The Templar Legacy and the Masonic Inheritance within Roslin Chapel, Tim Wallace Murphy, 1993, Friends of Roslin, Roslin, Scotland. 14. The Glastonbury Legends, R. F. Treherne, 1967, Sphere Books, London. 15. St. Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury, Lionel Smith at Lewis, 1922, James Clark and Company, Cambridge. 16. Genesis, David Wood, 1986, Tunbridge Wells, UK 17. The Templars, Knights of God, Edward Berman, 1986, Destiny Books, Rochester, Vermont. 18. The Druids, Stuart Piggott, 1967, Thames and Hudson, London. 19. Atlantis to the Latter Days, H. C. Randall Stevens, 1957, The Knights Templar of Aquarius, London. 20. The Search for the Stone of Destiny, Pat Gerber, 1992, Canongate Press, Edinburgh. Knights of the Temple, the founding of the order, founded in 1118 CE and destroyed on Friday 13, 1307. The Knights Templar, or Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon, to quote their full title. 1. Have contributed to modern society the most inauspicious date in the calendar, so that even those who know nothing of them are influenced indirectly by them through superstition. The purpose of forming the order was to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land from bandits, muggers and Saracens. Unlike most medieval knights, the Templars took vows of poverty, supposedly represented on their seal as two knights sharing one horse, chastity and obedience. They were monks, but they were fearsome warriors as well, and their service won them a glorious reputation as pious brothers dedicated to the Lord and benevolent to pilgrims. It also won them gifts and donations from wealthy Europeans which other religious orders envied, and it ultimately won them the ultimate gift available to any religious order. Pope Innocent II granted them total freedom from every authority but his own. They were answerable to no monarch, law, bishop or archbishop, and they could collect tithes but didn't have to pay any themselves. Basically, they were above every law and answerable only to the Pope. It was this freedom which also allowed them their own chaplains, churches and cemeteries, too. And it was this that contributed to their aura of secrecy and enabled them to do whatever they liked behind closed doors. There are some curiosities about their foundation. When they arrived in Jerusalem in 1119, which at that time was a Christian kingdom after a successful crusade, they asked King Baldwin if they could have their headquarters on the Temple Mount, the site of the original Temple of Solomon. The king consented and gave them part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque adjacent to the Dome of the Rock, despite the fact that his palace was also there. What is most unusual about this is that at this point there were only 9 knights, and they remained only 9 in number for the first 9 years of their existence. 3. And there is no evidence that they protected pilgrims during this period. 4. The most striking point about this to my mind is that while these 9 French blokes were claiming to protect pilgrims and actually doing very little, apparently, for the first 9 years of their order's existence, the Knights Hospitaller were actually doing this job and providing food and accommodation for these pilgrims to a high standard. They never received the same freedoms from the Pope as the Templars, but eventually created their own freedom when they managed to acquire Malta for their own personal use. Incidentally, this order was the source of what is now the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. It seems strange that this anomaly was not recorded at the time and that all the Templars' benefactors were so easily duped. Or were they? After the Templars were recognized by the Pope, there was a rapid increase in the amount of donations they received. This often included land, which was then turned to profit. When new members were recruited into the order, they turned all of their possessions over to the temple, and because many knights were nobles, many estates were acquired for the order throughout Europe. Where they had territory, they often set up a preceptory where the Templars lived out their monastic rule, and they sometimes set up a larger church too, instead of the usual small chapel attached to a preceptory. Temple Church in London is the most famous English Templar church, but they had a church at Garway in Herefordshire and also one in Hereford itself. 5. To name the only 2 known Templar churches in Hereford and Worcester. The outstanding feature of Templar and also Hospitaller churches is their round nave. The nave is the bit people normally sit in to listen to services. This was done to imitate the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was a symbol of the Holy Land and where the Templars had their headquarters. A round nave has interesting implications. An ordinary rectangular nave focuses attention on the activities of the priest at the altar or pulpit. If the Templars sat or stood in a circle, the nature of the service would have felt more equal and possibly would have been more in keeping with brotherhood, than being lectured at by an elevated preacher.
If their activities were a cult as has been suggested, then a round nave would have been appropriate in other ways too.
Their property outside of the Holy Land was used for money-making, sending disabled or injured knights to rest, recruiting, training and doing the religious business that has proven so mysterious.
All of this was geared towards maintaining a military presence in the Holy Land, which included building huge castles and doing battle with Saracens, and occasionally other crusaders.
Donations were received at these places too, and often the Templars acted as feudal lords over large estates which needed to be managed as businesses. It is worth noting that the first windmill ever recorded in England was on a Templar property. It is thought they brought the idea over from the Middle East. See Temple Balsall by Eileen Gooder. The wealth and power of the Templars was massive.
The scale of their buildings in the Holy Land was equally massive. Chastel Pellerin, Castle Pilgrim, had an outer wall 6 meters wide and 16 meters high, and 2 of its towers were more than 34 meters high.
Add to this that it was built on a spit of land in the sea and that it had its own harbor, and an impressive picture emerges. This castle was the Templars' most important base in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, 6, and was the point from which the last Crusaders left on the 14th of August 1291 when they were ousted by Muslim forces. 7. The fall of the Templars after the Holy Land was lost and it became clear that it would not be regained. The real power of the Templars became evident because it was not being focused abroad. They owned almost as much land in France as the king did, which rather annoyed him. In England, King John, buried in Worcester, where I live, pawned the crown jewels to them for 6 years because he was broke. 8. This type of financial power, coupled with a highly disciplined and effective army of warrior monks on an international level, caused some tinges of jealousy, greed and fear in certain European nobles. Notably King Philip IV of France. 9. This king has the added feeling of humiliation after being rejected when he asked to join the order. He eventually managed to engineer a candidate of his choosing to the position of Pope, Clement V, who then owed the king a favor. Philip plotted the mass arrest of the Templars and tried to get the Pope to add his weight to the proceedings. He was very reluctant, but Philip began a public character assassination campaign against him until he crumbled into submission and supported the dissolution of the Templars. On Friday 13th, at dawn, all Templars in France were seized and arrested. Envelopes containing orders were opened simultaneously by French sheriffs, which gave them the element of surprise in the endeavor. 10. The property of the Templars was mostly turned over to the Hospitallers, but the great treasure of the Templars managed to evade the dawn strike. It is now known how their rumored secret source of wealth disappeared, and, equally mysteriously, the entire naval fleet of the Templars, which was considerable, disappeared. 11. The trial, though highly corrupt, revealed the truth behind some of the rumors of heresy in the order which Philip had used to legitimize this attack. In France, the Templars were promised leniency if they confessed to charges of heresy, sodomy and obscenity, and promised death if they refused. The full trial did not begin there until April 1310, and by May 54 men had refused to withdraw their repudiation if initial confessions and were handed over to the secular authorities to be burned at the stake. 12. Templars traveled far and wide over their territories, and it is reasonable to assume that many French Templars were abroad at the time of the arrests. Nowhere were they so harshly treated as in France. In Scotland and particularly in Portugal, there was no serious effort to suppress the order. In Portugal they became the Knights of Christ, and in Scotland they are thought to have fought at the Battle of Bannockburn and to have been the source of certain Masonic traditions. 13. Anyway, in October 1307, King Philip of France sent a letter to Edward II in England, who had only been king for a couple of months and who was Philip's future son-in-law, asking him to arrest the Templars in the same way as he had done. Edward refused. In fact, he sent several letters to other European monarchs asking them to ignore the charges against the Templars, saying that they were inspired by greed and jealousy. Pope Clement V ended up having to tell Edward to begin proceedings against the order. On the 20th of December, Edward wrote a letter to all his sheriffs, as the French king had done, and on 9th, 10th and the 11th of January 1308, the English Templars were placed in safe custody. 14. On their arrest, an inventory of their property was done. In England, this showed that many once prosperous Templar manors and preceptories had fallen into serious disrepair. In some instances, this could be attributed to the Templars doing a runner. It was several months after the arrests in France that the English were arrested, plenty of time to arrange a holiday. In many cases, however, the property was dilapidated through old age, and some people regard this as evidence of the order's weakness in its latter stages. 15. The loss of the Holy Land and the realization that another crusade was not likely would have depleted morale somewhat, and it is not exactly fuel to the fire of enthusiasm in a new recruit. They weren't attracting as many new members, and they had nothing to work for because their military activities were over, other than their securica activities as pawnbrokers and bankers. The final battles in the Holy Land left many disabled and injured knights as well as all those who died. So all of this is bound to have placed an enormous strain on the order and helps explain the state of decay on some of their properties. The charges and the trials on Tuesday the 21st of October 1309, the trial began in England. It was held in London with the Bishop of London, 2 papal inquisitors, probably Dominicans of the Inquisition fame, the Pope's chaplain and 3 public notaries. 16. Internationally there were many different confessions. But here are the principal heresies quoted from John J. Robinson's book. The confessions stated that in their initiations they had been required to bestow the osculum infame, or kiss of shame, on the prior, on his mouth, or on his navel, or below his spine. They had been required to spit on the cross. Denying Christ, the Templars had worshipped a head, or a head with 3 faces, or a head with 4 feet, or a head with just 2 feet. It was a metal head, or a wooden head, or a human skull set in a reliquary. A couple of Templars confessed that the head was named Baphomet. Some confessed that they had also worshipped an idol in the form of a cat, which was red, or gray, or black, or mottled. Sometimes the idol worship required kissing the cat below the tail. Sometimes the cat was greased with the fat from roasted babies. The Templars were forced to eat food which contained the ashes of dead Templars, a form of witchcraft that passed on the courage of the fallen knights. Some said they had to wear a cord next to their skin after the cord had touched the idol. 17. At the Paris temple, a silver head was found with small bones inside, which appeared to have been made to house holy relics. 18. This is one of the few pieces of material evidence to support the Templar association with heads. In England, a Templar named Henry de Lawald confessed to kissing on the mouth at initiations, but to no other parts of the body. And preceptor Simon Stresh said that he thought receptions everywhere were the same as in the chief convent, meaning the Paris temple where a head was found. A knight named Robert de Hamilton, when asked about the use of idols attached to the girdles that the Templars wore over their vests, said that the use of the girdle was honorable and called it the girdle of Nazareth, and said, "It was touched on a certain column, and that they all carry what girdle they wished." 19. An interesting piece of evidence against them was a Franciscan who said that, about 20 years ago, the Grand Preceptor had some relics that he wanted to show the brothers at Wetherby. At dead of night there was shouting in the chapel, and the Franciscan got up and looked through the keyhole, and saw a great light. The next day he asked a brother about the night's events, and the brother told him to go on his way and never speak of it for fear of his life. 20. An interesting quote in Crusader Castles, by Hugh Kennedy, is a report by Imad al-Din of what he thought of the Templar castle of Lafeve after it had been conquered in 1187 by Saladin, the Saracen leader. He says, "It was a place where they met and received people, a place where they guarded their horses, a place where the torrents of their men flowed, a meeting place of their brethren, the residence of their devil and the place of their crosses, where their masses assembled and their fire was kindled."
21. What are we to make of these?
The reference to idols attached to girdles probably relates to a sacred cord which the Templars are supposed to have kept next to their flesh. This may have been something adopted into the Templars from the Gnostic Cathars who lived in the Languedoc region of France. 22. They were heretics, according to the Pope, and the Albigensian Crusade ordered by him and carried out largely by the Teutonic Knights slaughtered most of them.
What about Baphomet?
The worship of an idol in the shape of a head was one of the most persistent accusations leveled against them. Intelligence gained by royal spies who had infiltrated the order prior to the raids also reported the name Baphomet.
23. In The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Bagent, Lee and Lincoln, the possible meaning of this name is explored.
Early examiners of the issue often thought that Baphomet was a corruption of Muhammad. The authors mentioned above point out that if Baphomet was merely God of Allah, why bother renaming him Baphomet? The name could also be a corruption of Abu-Fihamet, which means father of understanding, of father of wisdom.
24. If this is the case, the Templars had adopted Sufism into their rituals. Montague Summers suggested that the name was a combination of two Greek words, bath and meti, and meant absorption into wisdom.
The Essenes, to avoid persecution and because they were a secret sect, employed the uses of ciphers and codes to hide the identities of important names. One such cipher, known to Bible scholars and translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the Atbash cipher. To use the cipher, you swap the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet for the last, second for second to last, third for third to last, and so on. This means that Aleph equals Tau, Bet equals Shin, hence the name Atbash. Essene knowledge got passed on to the Gnostics, and Gnostics then passed it on to the Cathars. The Knights Templar was at one time enrolling many Cathar nobles as new recruits. It is likely that among the knowledge passed to the Templars from the Cathars would have been the knowledge of the Essene ciphers, including Atbash. Hugh Schonfield obviously thought so, since he didn't hesitate in applying the Atbash cipher to what he saw as the obviously artificial name Baphomet. So Hugh wrote out the name Baphomet in Hebrew, applied the cipher and revealed the word Sophia.
Baphomet was the Greek goddess of wisdom.
The Inquisition had thought that Baphomet was the bearded male head that the Templars prostrated themselves before and which spoke to them and gave them occult powers. Sophia, however, is obviously female, and Hugh was not surprised to note that Inquisition records also show that in Templar hands was a casket surmounted by a great head of gilded silver, most beautiful, and constituting the image of a woman.
But what of the male head?
This was Adam Kadmon, and the head was denominated in Hebrew as Chakma, i.e. wisdom.
Even before the discovery of Baphomet's true name, the feminine side of this deity had begun to manifest.
Most modern depictions of Baphomet show him with a goat's head, breasts, 2, 4 or even 6, wings, angelic or demonic, a phallus, usually a very big one, and hooked legs. So Baphomet had already emerged as androgynous, even before the discovery of his being the blending of Adam Kadmon, essentially a god, although Jews and derivative monotheists wouldn't see it that way, and the goddess Sophia due to an Inquisition error. The Templar head cult, a good explanation for the Templar head worship, covers another bunch of heretics from the East. The Johannite or Mandaean heresy denounced Jesus as a false prophet and acknowledged John the Baptist as the true Messiah. In the Holy Blood, the authors assert that, in the course of their activities in the Middle East, the Templars undoubtedly established contact with Johannite sects. 25. John the Baptist was decapitated, hence the worship of a head. In Turin's Shroud, in whose image? Where Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince effectively demonstrate that Leonardo da Vinci created the shroud, this link is reaffirmed. The reason the head of the shroud is not quite connected to the unreasonably long body is partly because Leonardo, as Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, wanted to allude to John the Baptist in the image. 26. The Priory of Sion still exists today and is historically linked to the Templars. 27. The Mandaean heresy connection seems to me to be the most likely explanation of the head worship of the Templars. One of the orders that absorbed the Templars' lands was the Knights Hospitallers, or the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. I am mildly surprised that the order's obvious reverence for St. John has not been fully researched in an esoteric light by the very capable authors noted above. Especially considering that St. John's right hand is one of the relics owned by the order, preserved in the private chapel of the Winter Palace at St. Petersburg in Russia. 28. An upward-pointing right hand is a characteristic of some of Leonardo's paintings, and it is noted in the Turin Shroud, in whose image, as one of the clues which he left relating to the John the Baptist connection with the Priory of Sion, and hence Templars. 29. But the order's ownership of this relic is not mentioned in this otherwise mind-blowing book. I liked it. Aleister Crowley, the infamous Great Beast, was very into the Templars. He wrote a play about them. 30. He was very familiar with the Templar orders and Freemasonry, as self-styled Inspector General of Masonic Rites. 31. And he took the name Baphomet for his position as Grand Master of the Ordo Templi Orientis. 32. He explored the meaning and numerology of the name and says it could mean baptism of wisdom, furthering the John the Baptist links, or that it is a corruption of a title meaning Father Mithras. He says that this latter interpretation shows why the Templars gave that name to their idol. Baphomet was Father Mithras, the cubical stone which was the corner of the temple. Relating to the headquarters of the Templars on the site of the original Temple of Solomon. 33. Other sources connect Baphomet with Cernunnos, the god of the witches, and say that the Templars preserved the deeper aspects of the old ways in their inner rites. Eliphas Levi, who also showed an interest in the Templars, equated Baphomet with the goat of the Sabbath. 34. Incidentally, Crowley believed he was Levi in a former incarnation. There are many lines of enquiry into Baphomet in the field of magic, too long-winded to detail here. The Cathar connection, the supposed attributes of the Templar head are interesting in that they are very similar to the qualities given to Bran's head and to the Holy Grail. That is, making the land fertile, enriching the people, and basically being pretty darn groovy. In Parsifal, Wolfram von Eschenbach describes the Grail as a stone. He also describes the Guardians of the Grail as Templars, and Wolfram himself was a contemporary of the Templars. 35. Could this mean that Crowley was right? Some people say that, even though Wolfram called them Templars, the knights in Parsifal are not necessarily Templars. Primarily because the Templar's sign is a cross pate, not a turtle dove, as in Parsifal, and because the knights in Parsifal go forth to quest in a manner now concurrent with what history knows of the Templars. Another point made is that if Wolfram had really wanted to portray the Templars, he undoubtedly could have made a better job of clarifying their identity. 36. Naming them Templars in the story is clear enough. And a dove is sometimes associated with the Cathars. 37. Who the Templars certainly mixed with and maybe got their treasure from. And indeed it was no less than John the Baptist who saw a dove descending as the Holy Spirit. 38. So these errors make sense if Wolfram was trying to hint about a connection between the Templars, Cathars, John the Baptist and the Grail, or treasure, which has been successfully shown in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail anyway. That all this occurs in an Arthurian context, linking it up with older tales like that of Bran's Head perhaps, suggests that Wolfram wanted to allude to that too. The similarities between Baphomet and Bran's Head, the Grail, are striking anyway, so to have Wolfram linking these up through the Templars prior to their trial is certainly an interesting coincidence if nothing else. In The Sign and the Seal, Graham Hancock shows how Wolfram could have known all of this. If what the Templars were up to with Baphomet was anything near as weird as the Bran's Head stuff, or even the Orphic traditions from Greece, could our Franciscan friends, Great Light, and the Silver Head from the Paris Temple be evidence of this? The aftermath. Some final interesting points. When Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar before the trial, and Geoffrey de Charnay, the Order's treasurer, were burnt at the stake, Jacques is reported to have issued a final curse. He called his persecutors, Pope Clement and King Philip, to join him and account for themselves before the court of God within the year. Within a month Pope Clement was dead, supposedly from a sudden onslaught of dysentery. By the end of the year Philip was dead as well, from causes which remain obscure to this day. 39. As evidence that the Templars remained close to certain French hearts in more recent times, probably through Freemasonry, the scene of the execution of King Louis XVI in 1789, French Revolution, needs a brief review. After the guillotine had fallen and the king's head lay in a basket, an unknown man is reported to have leapt onto the scaffold. He dipped his hand into the monarch's blood and flung it out over the surrounding throng and cried, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged." 40. So many different things have been affected by the Templars that squeezing like their travels to America. 41. And their quest for the lost Ark of the Covenant, 42, simply was not possible in this comparatively tiny article. Inquiring minds should consult the list of references for this article and do much further reading. Happy crusading, or head-hunting, and less of that orifice kissing. Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Order, usually, Hospital Sancta Maria de Teutonicorum Jerusalemitinem, the Hospital of St. Mary of the Germans of Jerusalem, or the Order of the German Houses, in the sources, was one of the three major knightly or military orders that originated and evolved during the 12th and 13th centuries. The Templars and Hospitallers are the other major orders. The military orders were true orders of the Roman Church governed by regulations similar to those governing monks, generally variants of the Benedictine or Augustinian rules. For most purposes, they were technically answerable only to the Pope. They did have some feudal responsibilities to lay and other clerical entities as dictated by circumstances of place and time. Large numbers of knights became monks but often were found in military fortifications rather than monasteries. The members of most orders took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Origins of the Teutonic Order. According to tradition, early in the 12th century a wealthy German couple built a hospital in Jerusalem at their own expense to care for poor and sick pilgrims who spoke German. The hospital and an accompanying chapel were dedicated to the Virgin Mary. This story is similar to the traditions of the origin of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem founded by Amalfitans. The German hospital apparently was affiliated with the Hospital of St. John, at least, in the observance of the rule of St. Augustine. After Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem in 1187, there are no more records of the German hospital there. There was no indication that the German hospital ever had a military mission. During the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, probably 1190, Germans from Lübeck and Bremen established a field hospital for German soldiers, reportedly using ship's sails as cover from the elements. Duke Frederick of Swabia placed his chaplain Conrad in charge of the hospital and soon transformed the organization into a religious order responsible to the local Latin bishop. Although some scholars question its authenticity, Pope Clement III, 1187–1191, apparently approved the order on February 6, 1191. The order was taken under Pope Celestine III's, 1191–1198, protection on December 21, 1196, with the name of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem. The name is possibly the only connection with the earlier German hospital, although some argue a more direct relationship with the earlier hospital. A ceremony purportedly held on March 5, 1198, altered the order's raison d'etre. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the King of Jerusalem, the head of the crusading army, and the Masters of the Templars and the Hospital of St. John attended the celebration, establishing the Teutonic Knights as a military order. A bull by Pope Innocent III, 1198–1216, dated February 19, 1199, confirmed the event and specified the order would care for the sick according to the rule of the Hospitallers. It would conduct its other business by following the Templar rule and would wear the temple's distinctive white cloak. Its black cross would differentiate the Teutonic order from the temple. Internal structure: during the first 20 years of its existence, the institutional structure of the order developed and stabilized. The Teutonic order followed the lead of the Templars and Hospitallers by creating a system of provinces. Unlike monastic orders composed of independent abbeys, the Teutonic Knights had a hierarchical chain of command with commanderies, house, commendae, at the lowest level. Provinces or bailiwicks, bailli, comtere, were parts of countries that composed the order as a whole. Its first independent rule was adopted in 1264. The officials governing the Teutonic order at the various levels were commander, comter, preceptor, at the local level, province commander, landkircher, national commander, landmeister, and grand master, hochmeister, magister. The highest leadership positions, including Grand Master, Grand Commander, Grosskomter, Marshal, Ordenmarschall, Draper or Quartermaster, Trapier, Hospitaller, Spittler, and Treasurer, Tressler, were elected by the General Chapter. Membership of this mostly German-speaking order was composed of various, distinct classes: knights, priests, and other brothers, lay brothers, sisters, and familiars. There was a large number of people who supported the professed members of the order, ranging from auxiliary knights to slaves. The highest ranking were secular knights, serving for free. Turcopoles, Greek for son of Turk, were originally probably lightly armed, half-breed cavalry whose name applied to Turkish mercenaries employed in the Byzantine army. Later the term was adopted by the military orders. There were attendants called squires, knecht, and sergeants at arms. Foot soldiers were usually coerced from the local peasantry. Sister aides, Helfschwestern, were employed as domestics, as were Helfbrüder. They took religious vows. Married and single lay domestics also were employed by the order. Artisans and laborers, e.g., gardeners, carpenters, masons, worked for charity or wages. Many serfs and slaves were owned by the order. Rapid expansion from the outset, the possessions and wealth of the Teutonic order grew astoundingly fast and its numbers skyrocketed, especially under Grand Master Hermann von Salza, circa 1210 to -1239. Von Salza was successful in gaining many favors for the order because he was a confidant to both the German Emperor Frederick II, 1211 to -1250, and the popes. His immediate successors also did well. Between 1215 and 1300, one or more commanderies were founded each year, usually through gifts. The Teutonic Order was invited into Greece, 1209, Hungary, 1211, and Prussia, 1226, by secular rulers to perform military duties on their behalf. In the Peloponnesus, the Frankish prince of Achaia provided fiefs near Kalamata for the Teutonic Knights in return for military service. There are traces of the order's continuous service there until 1500. The Hungarian king Andrew II, 1205 to -1235, expelled the order in 1225 when it became strong and may have threatened his rule. The conquest of Prussia began in 1230, after the order's Grand Master was named Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, and lasted until 1283. In addition to the Holy Land and these other theaters of war, the order's members could be found elsewhere in the Mediterranean and Western Europe: Armenia, Cyprus, Sicily, Apulia, Lombardy, Spain, France, Alsace, Austria, Bohemia, the Lowlands, Germany, and Livonia. Only in the frontier areas, the Holy Land, Armenia, Greece, Hungary, Prussia, Spain, and Livonia, was military service required of members. By 1221, the German order was given the same privileges as the Templars and Hospitallers by Pope Honorius III, 1216 to -1227. Both senior orders fought the autonomy of the Teutonic Order until about 1240. The German order may not have quite equaled in wealth and possessions the other two military orders, which were more than 80 years older, but it became the only other order to rival them in international influence and activity. The Baltic, after the Crusaders were defeated at Acre in 1291, the Teutonic Order moved its headquarters to Venice, a longtime ally. In 1309, the order moved again, this time to Marienburg in Prussia. Here the order had subdued the pagan inhabitants and established a theocratic form of government. The position of the knights in the Baltic region had been strengthened in 1237 when a knightly order in Livonia, the Brothers of the Sword, Schwartbrüder, joined the Teutonic Order. The history of the German knights in Prussia and Livonia is one of almost perpetual revolts, uprisings, raids, conquests, victories, and defeats. Many secular knights from Western Europe, e.g., Chaucer's knight in the Canterbury Tales, would go to the Baltic to help the order in crusading activities for a season or more. The Grand Master's prizes and feasting for especially heroic knights became legendary and reminds one of various aspects of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. During the 14th century, dozens of towns and about 2,000 villages were created in Prussia by the order. The order was successful in trade. For example, as a Hanseatic League participant, it provided Western Europe with some of its cheapest grain. The nations of Poland and Lithuania, perennial enemies of the order, became stronger and stronger in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. In 1410 at Tannenberg, the order was crushed in a battle against a coalition led by these powers. The result was a bankrupting of the order and significant reduction in its military and political capabilities. In 1467, the whole of western Prussia was ceded to Poland and the eastern part acknowledged the suzerainty of the King of Poland. 1525 to 1797 Martin Luther's 1483 to 1546 Reformation affected the Teutonic Order significantly. In 1525, Grand Master Albrecht von Brandenburg converted to the Lutheran faith. He then was enfoethed by the Polish king as Duke of Prussia. As a medieval, crusading entity, the German order essentially ended at this time. In 1526, the Teutonic Order Master of the German lands became the administrator of the Grand Mastery in Prussia and Master in German and Romance countries.
Mergentheim became the main seat of the order.
There was a great deal of confusion in Germany in the aftermath of the Reformation, its resulting wars, and the political changes. The bailiwicks of Saxony, Messe, and Thuringia became Protestant until Napoleonic times. The office of Lancashire alternated among Lutheran, Reformed, and Catholic leaders in the 16th and 17th centuries.
The bailiwick of Utrecht was Calvinist until modern times.
A new rule was adopted in 1606 in an attempt to accommodate the changes in the order.
In European affairs, from time to time, the order still participated militarily.
Some 1,000 troops were raised to help the Austrians against the Turks. After 1696, there was a regiment of the Grand and German Master.
But the numbers and wealth of the order dwindled. Little other military activity is recorded.
The French Revolution and after as the anti-clerical French government expanded its political control in the 1790s, the order lost its commanderies in Belgium and those west of the Rhine, 1797. Many east of the Rhine were lost in 1805. In 1809, Napoleon dissolved the order in all countries under his dominion, leaving only the properties in the Austrian Empire.
Even in Austria, the order had to exist secretly for a number of years until 1839 when Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I reconstituted the order as the Order of the Teutonic Knights, Deutscher Ritterorden.
The mission fulfilled by the order was mainly the caring for wounded soldiers. In 1866, the Honorable Knights of the Teutonic Order was founded. Knights were required to provide annual contributions for hospitals. The Mariner des Deutschen Ordens, for women, was created in 1871. In 1914, some 1,500 sponsors from the Austrian nobility supported the care-giving efforts of the order. During World War I, the order took care of about 3,000 wounded soldiers in their facilities. In 1923, masters of the order were allowed to come from among the clerics rather than the knighthood for the first time.
Under National Socialist rule, the order was dissolved in Austria in 1938 and Czechoslovakia in 1939.
The leaders of the Third Reich abused the history of the Teutonic Order. After World War II, the order began anew in Germany. Its possessions in Austria were returned.
In Italy, the order had changed little.
A great deal of support for the caretaking and missionary order has been found in Germany, Austria, Italy, Belgium, and even in North and Central America.
The order's headquarters, treasury, and archives are now located in Vienna, Austria.
Commanders First Grand Master Hugues de Payens, Last Grand Master Jacques de Molay, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Latin, Paupers Camilitones Christi Templique Salomonici. Commonly known as the Knights Templar, the Order of the Temple, French, Ordre du Temple or Templiers, or simply as Templars, were among the most wealthy and powerful of the Western Christian military orders.
The organization existed for nearly 2 centuries during the Middle Ages.
Officially endorsed by the Catholic Church around 1129, the order became a favored charity throughout Christendom and grew rapidly in membership and power. Templar Knights, in their distinctive white mantles with a red cross, were among the most skilled fighting units of the Crusades. Non-combatant members of the order managed a large economic infrastructure throughout Christendom, innovating financial techniques that were an early form of banking, and building fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land. The Templars' existence was tied closely to the Crusades. When the Holy Land was lost, support for the order faded. Rumors about the Templars' secret initiation ceremony created mistrust, and King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, took advantage of the situation. In 1307, many of the order's members in France were arrested, tortured into giving false confessions, and then burned at the stake. Under pressure from King Philip, Pope Clement V disbanded the order in 1312. The abrupt disappearance of a major part of the European infrastructure gave rise to speculation and legends, which have kept the Templar name alive into the modern day. After the First Crusade recaptured Jerusalem in 1099, many Christian pilgrims traveled to visit what they referred to as the holy places. However, though the city of Jerusalem was under relatively secure control, the rest of Outremer was not. Bandits abounded, and pilgrims were routinely slaughtered, sometimes by the hundreds, as they attempted to make the journey from the coastline at Jaffa into the Holy Land. In 1120, the French knight Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and Warmond, Patriarch of Jerusalem, and proposed creating a monastic order for the protection of these pilgrims. King Baldwin and Patriarch Warmond agreed to the request, probably at the Council of Nablus in January 1120, and the king granted the Templars a headquarters in a wing of the royal palace on the Temple Mount in the captured Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Temple Mount had a mystique because it was above what was believed to be the ruins of the Temple of Solomon. The Crusaders therefore referred to the Al-Aqsa Mosque as Solomon's Temple, and it was from this location that the new order took the name of Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, or Templar, Knights. The order, with about 9 knights including Godfrey de Saint-Omer and André de Montbert, had few financial resources and relied on donations to survive. Their emblem was of 2 knights riding on a single horse, emphasizing the order's poverty. The Templars' impoverished status did not last long. They had a powerful advocate in Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a leading church figure and a nephew of André de Montbert, one of the founding knights. Bernard put his weight behind them and wrote persuasively on their behalf in the letter, in praise of the new knighthood, and, in 1129, at the Council of Troyes he led a group of leading churchmen to officially approve and endorse the order on behalf of the Church. With this formal blessing, the Templars became a favored charity throughout Christendom, receiving money, land, businesses, and noble-born sons from families who were eager to help with the fight in the Holy Land. Another major benefit came in 1139, when Pope Innocent II's papal bull Omne Datum Optimum exempted the order from obedience to local laws. This ruling meant that the Templars could pass freely through all borders, were not required to pay any taxes, and were exempt from all authority except that of the Pope. With its clear mission and ample resources, the order grew rapidly. Templars were often the advance force in key battles of the Crusades, as the heavily armored knights on their warhorses would set out to charge at the enemy, in an attempt to break opposition lines. One of their most famous victories was in 1177 during the Battle of Montgisard, where some 500 Templar knights helped several thousand infantry to defeat Saladin's army of more than 26,000 soldiers. Although the primary mission of the order was military, relatively few members were combatants. The others acted in support positions to assist the knights and to manage the financial infrastructure. The Templar order, though its members were sworn to individual poverty, was given control of wealth beyond direct donations. A nobleman who was interested in participating in the Crusades might place all his assets under Templar management while he was away. Accumulating wealth in this manner throughout Christendom and the Outremer, the order in 1150 began generating letters of credit for pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Pilgrims deposited their valuables with a local Templar preceptory before embarking, received a document indicating the value of their deposit, then used that document upon arrival in the Holy Land to retrieve their funds. This innovative arrangement was an early form of banking, and may have been the first formal system to support the use of checks. It improved the safety of pilgrims by making them less attractive targets for thieves, and also contributed to the Templar coffers. Based on this mix of donations and business dealing, the Templars established financial networks across the whole of Christendom. They acquired large tracts of land, both in Europe and the Middle East. They bought and managed farms and vineyards. They built churches and castles. They were involved in manufacturing, import and export. They had their own fleet of ships. And at one point they even owned the entire island of Cyprus. The Order of the Knights Templar arguably qualifies as the world's first multinational corporation. In the mid-12th century, the tide began to turn in the Crusades. The Muslim world had become more united under effective leaders such as Saladin, and dissension arose among Christian factions in and concerning the Holy Land. The Knights Templar were occasionally at odds with the two other Christian military orders, the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, and decades of internecine feuds weakened Christian positions, politically and militarily. After the Templars were involved in several unsuccessful campaigns, including the pivotal Battle of the Horns of Hattin, Jerusalem was captured by Saladin's forces in 1187. The Crusaders retook the city in 1229, without Templar aid, but held it only briefly. In 1244, the Khwarezmi Turks recaptured Jerusalem, and the city did not return to Western control until 1917 when the British captured it from the Ottoman Turks. The Templars were forced to relocate their headquarters to other cities in the north, such as the seaport of Acre, which they held for the next century, which was also lost in 1291, followed by their last mainland strongholds, Tortosa, Tartus in what is now Syria, and Atlat in present-day Israel. Their headquarters then moved to Limassol on the island of Cyprus, and they also attempted to maintain a garrison on tiny Arwad Island, just off the coast from Tortosa. In 1300, there was some attempt to engage in coordinated military efforts with the Mongols via a new invasion force at Arwad. In 1302 or 1303, however, the Templars lost the island to the Egyptian Mamluks in the siege of Arwad. With the island gone, the Crusaders lost their last foothold in the Holy Land. With the Order's military mission now less important, support for the organization began to dwindle. The situation was complex, though, as over the 200 years of their existence, the Templars had become a part of daily life throughout Christendom. The organization's Templar houses, hundreds of which were dotted throughout Europe and the Near East, gave them a widespread presence at the local level. The Templars still managed many businesses, and many Europeans had daily contact with the Templar network, such as by working at a Templar farm or vineyard, or using the Order as a bank in which to store personal valuables. The Order was still not subject to local government, making it everywhere a state within a state. Its standing army, though it no longer had a well-defined mission, could pass freely through all borders. This situation heightened tensions with some European nobility, especially as the Templars were indicating an interest in founding their own monastic state, just as the Teutonic Knights had done in Prussia and the Knights Hospitaller were doing with Rhodes. Arrests, charges and dissolution. In 1305, the new Pope Clement V, based in France, sent letters to both the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the Hospitaller Grand Master Fulk de Villeray to discuss the possibility of merging the two orders. Neither was amenable to the idea, but Pope Clement persisted, and in 1306 he invited both Grand Masters to France to discuss the matter. De Molay arrived first in early 1307, but de Villeray was delayed for several months. While waiting, de Molay and Clement discussed charges that had been made 2 years prior by an ousted Templar. It was generally agreed that the charges were false, but Clement sent King Philip IV of France a written request for assistance in the investigation. King Philip was already deeply in debt to the Templars from his war with the English and decided to seize upon the rumors for his own purposes. He began pressuring the Church to take action against the order, as a way of freeing himself from his debts. On Friday the 13th of October 1307, a date sometimes spuriously linked with the origin of the Friday the 13th superstition, Philip ordered de Molay and scores of other French Templars to be simultaneously arrested. The arrest warrant started with the phrase, Dieu n'est pas content, nous avons des ennemis de la foi dans le royaume. God is not pleased. We have enemies of the faith in the kingdom. The Templars were charged with numerous offenses, including apostasy, idolatry, heresy, obscene rituals and homosexuality, financial corruption and fraud, and secrecy. Many of the accused confessed to these charges under torture, and these confessions, even though obtained under duress, caused a scandal in Paris. All interrogations were recorded on a 30-meter-long parchment, kept at the Archives Nationales, in Paris. The prisoners were coerced to confess that they had spat on the cross. Moi Raymond de la Fère, 21 ans, reconnais que j'ai craché 3 fois sur la croix, mais de bouche et pas de cœur. Free translation. I, Raymond de la Fère, 21 years old, admit that I have spat 3 times on the cross, but only from my mouth and not from my heart. The Templars were accused of idolatry. After more bullying from Philip, Pope Clement V then issued the papal bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae on the 22nd of November 1307, which instructed all Christian monarchs in Europe to arrest all Templars and seize their assets. Pope Clement called for papal hearings to determine the Templars' guilt or innocence, and once freed of the Inquisitors' torture, many Templars recanted their confessions. Some had sufficient legal experience to defend themselves in the trials, but in 1310 Philip blocked this attempt, using the previously forced confessions to have dozens of Templars burned at the stake in Paris. With Philip threatening military action unless the Pope complied with his wishes, Pope Clement finally agreed to disband the order, citing the public scandal that had been generated by the confessions. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, he issued a series of papal bulls, including Vox in Excelso, which officially dissolved the order, and Ad Providem, which turned over most Templar assets to the Hospitallers. As for the leaders of the order, the elderly Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had confessed under torture, retracted his confession. Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, also retracted his confession and insisted on his innocence. Both men were declared guilty of being relapsed heretics, and they were sentenced to burn alive at the stake in Paris on the 18th of March 1314. De Molay reportedly remained defiant to the end, asking to be tied in such a way that he could face the Notre Dame Cathedral and hold his hands together in prayer. According to legend, he called out from the flames that both Pope Clement and King Philip would soon meet him before God. His actual words were recorded on the parchment as follows: Dieu sait qui est tort et est péché. Il va bientôt arriver malheur et ceux qui nous sont condamnés à mort. Free translation. God knows who is wrong and has sin. Soon a calamity will occur to those who have condemned us to death. Pope Clement died only a month later, and King Philip died in a hunting accident before the end of the year. With the last of the order's leaders gone, the remaining Templars around Europe were either arrested and tried under the papal investigation, with virtually none convicted, absorbed into other military orders such as the Knights Hospitaller, or pensioned and allowed to live out their days peacefully. By papal decree, the property of the Templars was transferred to the Order of Hospitallers, which also absorbed many of the Templars' members. In effect, the dissolution of the Templars could be seen as the merger of the two rival orders. Some may have fled to other territories outside papal control, such as excommunicated Scotland or to Switzerland. Templar organizations in Portugal simply changed their name, from Knights Templar to Knights of Christ. Chinon Parchment in September 2001. A document known as the Chinon Parchment, dated the 17th to the 20th of August 1308, was discovered in the Vatican secret archives by Barbara Fraile, apparently after having been filed in the wrong place in 1628. It is a record of the trial of the Templars and shows that Clement absolved the Templars of all heresies in 1308 before formally disbanding the order in 1312. As did another Chinon parchment dated the 20th of August 1308 addressed to Philip IV of France, also mentioning that all Templars that had confessed to heresy were restored to the sacraments and to the unity of the Church. This other Chinon parchment has been well known to historians, having been published by Étienne Balouse in 1693, and by Pierre de Pai in 1751. The current position of the Roman Catholic Church is that the medieval persecution of the Knights Templar was unjust, that nothing was inherently wrong with the order or its rule, and that Pope Clement was pressed into his actions by the magnitude of the public scandal and by the dominating influence of King Philip IV, who was Clement's relative.
Organization: the Templars were organized as a monastic order similar to Bernard's Cistercian order, which was considered the first effective international organization in Europe. The organizational structure had a strong chain of authority. Each country with a major Templar presence, France, England, Aragon, Portugal, Poitou, Apulia, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Anjou, Hungary, and Croatia, had a master of the order for the Templars in that region.
All of them were subject to the Grand Master, appointed for life, who oversaw both the order's military efforts in the east and their financial holdings in the west. The Grand Master exercised his authority via the Visitors General of the Order, who were knights specially appointed by the Grand Master and Convent of Jerusalem to visit the different provinces, correct malpractices, introduce new regulations, and resolve important disputes. The Visitors General had the power to remove knights from office and to suspend the master of the province concerned. No precise numbers exist, but it is estimated that at the order's peak there were between 15,000 and 20,000 Templars, of whom about a tenth were actual knights. Ranks within the order: there was a threefold division of the ranks of the Templars: the noble knights, the non-noble sergeants, and the chaplains. The Templars did not perform knighting ceremonies, so any knight wishing to become a Knight Templar had to already be a knight. They were the most visible branch of the order, and wore the famous white mantles to symbolize their purity and chastity. They were equipped as heavy cavalry, with 3 or 4 horses and 1 or 2 squires. Squires were generally not members of the order but were instead outsiders who were hired for a set period of time. Beneath the knights in the order and drawn from non-noble families were the sergeants. They brought vital skills and trades such as blacksmithing and building, and administered many of the order's European properties. In the Crusader states, they fought alongside the knights as light cavalry with a single horse. Several of the order's most senior positions were reserved for sergeants, including the post of commander of the Vault of Acre, who was the de facto admiral of the Templar fleet. The sergeants wore black or brown. From 1139, chaplains constituted a third Templar class. They were ordained priests who cared for the Templars' spiritual needs. All 3 classes of brother wore the order's Red Cross patty. Grand Masters, starting with founder Hugues de Payens in 1118 to 1119. The order's highest office was that of Grand Master, a position which was held for life, though considering the martial nature of the order, this could mean a very short tenure. All but 2 of the Grand Masters died in office, and several died during military campaigns. For example, during the Siege of Ascalon in 1153, Grand Master Bernard de Tremolay led a group of 40 Templars through a breach in the city walls. When the rest of the Crusader army did not follow, the Templars, including their Grand Master, were surrounded and beheaded. Grand Master Gérard de Riedfert was beheaded by Saladin in 1189 at the Siege of Acre. The Grand Master oversaw all of the operations of the order, including both the military operations in the Holy Land and Eastern Europe and the Templars' financial and business dealings in Western Europe. Some Grand Masters also served as battlefield commanders, though this was not always wise. Several blunders in de Riedfert's combat leadership contributed to the devastating defeat at the Battle of Hattin. The last Grand Master was Jacques de Molay, burned at the stake in Paris in 1314 by order of King Philip IV. Behavior and dress. It was Bernard de Clairvaux and founder Hugues de Payens who devised the specific code of behavior for the Templar order, known to modern historians as the Latin Rule. Its 72 clauses defined the ideal behavior for the knights, such as the types of garments they were to wear and how many horses they could have. Knights were to take their meals in silence, eat meat no more than 3 times per week, and not have physical contact of any kind with women, even members of their own family. A master of the order was assigned 4 horses, and 1 chaplain brother and 1 clerk with 3 horses, and 1 sergeant brother with 2 horses, and 1 gentleman valet to carry his shield and lance, with 1 horse. As the order grew, more guidelines were added, and the original list of 72 clauses was expanded to several hundred in its final form. The knights wore a white surcoat with a red cross and a white mantle. The sergeants wore a black tunic with a red cross on front and back and a black or brown mantle. The white mantle was assigned to the Templars at the Council of Troyes in 1129, and the cross was most probably added to their robes at the launch of the Second Crusade in 1147, when Pope Eugenius III, King Louis VII of France, and many other notables attended a meeting of the French Templars at their headquarters near Paris. According to their rule, the knights were to wear the white mantle at all times, even being forbidden to eat or drink unless they were wearing it. The red cross that the Templars wore on their robes was a symbol of martyrdom, and to die in combat was considered a great honor that assured a place in heaven. There was a cardinal rule that the warriors of the order should never surrender unless the Templar flag had fallen, and even then they were first to try to regroup with another of the Christian orders, such as that of the Hospitallers. Only after all flags had fallen were they allowed to leave the battlefield. This uncompromising principle, along with their reputation for courage, excellent training, and heavy armament, made the Templars one of the most feared combat forces in medieval times. Initiation, known as reception, receptio, into the order, was a profound commitment and involved a solemn ceremony. Outsiders were discouraged from attending the ceremony, which aroused the suspicions of medieval inquisitors during the later trials. New members had to willingly sign over all of their wealth and goods to the order and take vows of poverty, chastity, piety, and obedience. Most brothers joined for life, although some were allowed to join for a set period. Sometimes a married man was allowed to join if he had his wife's permission, but he was not allowed to wear the white mantle. Legacy. With their military mission and extensive financial resources, the Knights Templar funded a large number of building projects around Europe and the Holy Land. Many of these structures are still standing. Many sites also maintain the name Temple because of centuries-old association with the Templars. For example, some of the Templars' lands in London were later rented to lawyers, which led to the names of the Temple Bar Gateway and the Temple Tube Station. 2 of the 4 Inns of Court which may call members to act as barristers are the Inner Temple and Middle Temple. Distinctive architectural elements of Templar buildings include the use of the image of two knights on a single horse, representing the knight's poverty, and round buildings designed to resemble the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
Modern organizations. The story of the secretive yet powerful medieval Templars, especially their persecution and sudden dissolution, has been a tempting source for many other groups which have used alleged connections with the Templars as a way of enhancing their own image and mystery. There is no clear historical connection between the Knights Templar, which were dismantled in the rolls of the Catholic Church in the 1309 with the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay, and any of the modern organizations, of which, except for the publicly known Scottish Order, the earliest emerged publicly in the 18th century. There is often public confusion and many overlook the 400-year gap. However, Napoleon III officially recognized the OSMTH in 1853. The order operates on the basis of the traditions of the medieval Knights Templar. It reclaims the spirit of, but does not assert any direct descent from the ancient order founded by Hugues de Payens in 1118 and dissolved by Pope Clement V in 1312. Freemasonry. Since at least the 18th century, Freemasonry has incorporated Templar symbols and rituals in a number of Masonic bodies, most notably, the Order of the Temple. The final order joined in the United Religious, Military and Masonic Orders of the Temple and of St. John of Jerusalem, Palestine, Rhodes and Malta, commonly known as the Knights Templar. One theory of the origins of Freemasonry claims direct descent from the historical Knights Templar through its final 14th-century members who took refuge in Scotland, whose king, Robert the Bruce, was excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church at the time, or in Spain, who for a time were called Knights of Christ Cross. Other members having joined Knights of St. John. There have even been claims that some of the Templars who made it to Scotland contributed to the Scots' victory at Bannockburn. This theory is usually deprecated on grounds of lack of evidence, by both Masonic authorities and historians. The Roman Catholic Church has historically opposed Freemasonry since it began to emerge, under the belief the group is a secret society, and has a deeply hidden agenda that opposes the Church and its beliefs. Members of the Church found to be Freemasons were in the early 20th century, commonly excommunicated. This has often led to the misguided belief that the Church somehow also opposed the Knights Templar. However, the Church makes distinction between the Templars, a public monastic order, and secret societies. Excommunication as an action taken against Catholics who were found to be Freemason was lifted by Pope John Paul II in the 1980s. However, in the same papal bull he reiterated his predecessor's strong opposition to Freemasonry, stating that any person who is involved in a secret society and takes communion is putting their soul in grave danger. Legends and relics. The Knights Templar have supposedly become associated with legends concerning secrets and mysteries handed down to the select from ancient times. Rumors circulated even during the time of the Templars themselves. Freemasonic writers added their own speculations in the 19th century, and further fictional embellishments have been added in popular novels such as Ivanhoe, Foucault's Pendulum, The Lost Symbol, and The Da Vinci Code. Modern movies such as National Treasure and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and video games such as Assassin's Creed, The Secret World and Broken Sword. Many of the Templar legends are connected with the order's early occupation of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and speculation about what relics the Templars may have found there, such as the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant. That the Templars were in possession of some relics is certain. Many churches still display holy relics such as the bones of a saint, a scrap of cloth once worn by a holy man, or the skull of a martyr. The Templars did the same. They were documented as having a piece of the true cross, which the Bishop of Acre carried into battle at the disastrous Horns of Hattin. When the battle was lost, Saladin captured the relic, which was then ransomed back to the Crusaders when the Muslims surrendered the city of Acre in 1191.
The Templars were also rumored to possess the head of Saint Euphemia of Chalcedon, and the subject of relics came up during the Inquisition of the Templars, as several trial documents refer to the supposed worship of an idol of some type, referred to in some cases as a cat, a bearded head, or in some cases as Baphomet. This accusation of idol worship levied against the Templars has also led to the modern mistaken belief by some that the Templars practiced witchcraft. However, modern scholars generally explain the name Baphomet from the trial documents as simply a French misspelling of the name Muhammad. The Holy Grail quickly became associated with the Templars, even in the 12th century. The first Grail romance, Le Conte du Graal, was written around 1180 by Chrétien de Troyes, who came from the same area where the Council of Troyes had officially sanctioned the Templars' order. Perhaps 20 years later, Parzival, Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of the tale, refers to knights called Tempelisen, guarding the Grail kingdom. 93. Another hero of the Grail quest, Sir Galahad, a 13th-century literary invention of monks from St. Bernard's Cistercian order, was depicted bearing a shield with the cross of St. George, similar to the Templars' insignia. This version presented the Holy Grail as a Christian relic. A legend developed that since the Templars had their headquarters at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they must have excavated in search of relics, found the Grail, and then proceeded to keep it in secret and guard it with their lives. However, in the extensive documents of the Templar Inquisition there was never a single mention of anything like a Grail relic, let alone its possession by the Templars, nor is there any evidence that a Templar wrote a Grail romance. In reality, most mainstream scholars agree that the story of the Grail was just that, a literary fiction that began circulating in medieval times. Another legendary object that is claimed to have some connection with the Templars is the Shroud of Turin. In 1357, the shroud was first publicly displayed by a nobleman known as Geoffrey of Charny, described by some sources as being a member of the family of the grandson of Geoffroy de Charny, who was burned at the stake with de Molay. The shroud's origins are still a matter of controversy, but in 1988, a carbon dating analysis concluded that the shroud was made between 1260 and 1390, a span that includes the last half-century of the Templars' existence. The validity of the dating methodology has subsequently been called into question, and the age of the shroud is still the subject of much debate.